Study Session 7, Quasi-Experiments. Introduction. For one reason or another, many variables cannot be manipulated directly. One deterrent to the manipulation of variables in experiments is the ethical considerations, which all scientists must have. For instance, it is ethical to survey or otherwise observe the use of drugs by college students as long as permission is obtained. By no stretch of the imagination, however, would it be ethical to create a group of drug abusers and compare their activities with a non-abusers group that we have also created? A second barrier to manipulation is Mother Nature. Some variables, such as the sex of our subjects, cannot be varied by the experimenter (in brackets) except in a very rare and controversial circumstance. Other variables, such as natural disasters (in brackets tornadoes, hurricanes), or unnatural disasters such as wars, airplane crashes, etc., are both physical and moral difficult to implement. However, can we do experiments that concern this phenomena? After all, such variables and other like them are fascinating and may play an important part in human experience. You can conduct quasi-experiments regarding them. We shall now examine how to conduct quasi-experiments. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the quasi-experimental method. 2. Point out the merits and demerits of quasi-experiments. 3. Draw sound inferences in a quasi-experiment. The meaning of quasi-experiments. A quasi-experiment is similar to the ex post facto examination in correlation research, except that two or more levels of the variable of interest are examined rather than correlated. We wait for Mother Nature to do her work, and then we compare the effects of that independent variable with the effects that occur when that variable is not present or differs in some way. If we compare the reading ability of men with that of women, we have conducted a quasi-experiment. Advantages of quasi-experiments are obvious. They are naturally occurring independent variables, most of which have a high degree of intrinsic interest and important practical implications. In a quasi-experiment, we take advantage of observation and correlation procedures and combine them with the power of experimentation. A typical quasi-experiment has a subject variable as an independent variable. If we want to find out about almost any inherent subject variable, in brackets, age, sex, race, or ethnic group, socially caused subject attributes, in brackets, social class, region, mental illness, brain damage, or effects of disaster, we have to select rather than vary our independent variables, unless it is possible to do the experiment directly on infrahuman organisms. Implications of quasi-experiments. Although quasi-experiments are interesting and can contribute very important research, we should caution you here that the advantages of quasi-experiments are gained at the expense of control. When the researcher has to take what is given may include several important confounding variables. Because much research in psychology is concerned with subject variables, and because quasi-experiments using subject variables are likely to be confounded, we now have to examine the problems involved and possible solutions to them. An experimenter cannot manipulate a subject variable while holding other factors constant. He or she can only select subjects who already have the characteristic in some varying degree and then compare them on the behavior of interest. If the subjects in the different groups, say high, medium, and low IQ, differ on the behavior, we cannot conclude that the subject variable difference has produced or is responsible for the difference in behavior. The reason is that other factors may be covariant and confounded with the subject variable. If high IQ subjects perform some tasks better than low IQ subjects, we cannot say that IQ produces or causes the difference, because the different groups of subjects are likely to vary on other relevant dimensions such as motivation, education, and so forth. When subject variables are investigated, we cannot safely attribute differences in behavior to these variables, as we can with true experimental variables. Such designs then essentially produce correlations between variables. We can say that the variables are related, but we cannot say that one variable produces or causes the effect in the other variable. The above is a very important point. Let us consider an example. Suppose an investigator is interested in the intellectual functioning or lack thereof of people suffering from schizophrenia. People diagnosed as belonging to this group are given numerous tests that are meant to measure various mental abilities. The researcher also gives these tests to another group of people, so-called normal. He or she discovers that schizophrenics, especially poorly relative to normal people in tests involving semantic aspects of language, such as understanding the meanings of words or comprehending prose passages. The investigator concludes that schizophrenics perform these tests more poorly because they are schizophrenics, and that their inability to use language well in communication is likely attributable to schizophrenia. Studies such as these are common in some areas of psychology. Despite the fact that conclusions similar to these are often drawn from such studies, they are completely unwarranted. Both conclusions are based on correlations, and other factors could well be the critical ones. Schizophrenics may do more poorly than normal people for a number of reasons. They may not be as intelligent, as motivated, as educated, or as wise as taking tests. It may simply be that they have been institutionalized for a long time, with a resulting poverty of social and intellectual intercourse. So we cannot conclude that the reason that the two groups differ on verbal tests is attributable to schizophrenia or its absence in the two groups. Even if we conclude this, it will certainly not imply the other conclusion, that language problems are involved in causing schizophrenia. Again, all we would have is a correlation between these two variables, with no idea of whether or how the two are causally related. Use of subject variables is very common in all psychological research, but it is absolutely crucial in such areas as clinical and developmental psychology. Therefore, the problems with making inferences from such research should be carefully considered. A primary variable in developmental psychology is age, a subject variable. This means that much research in this field is correlational in nature. In general, the problem of individual differences among subjects in psychology is one that is often ignored, though there are often appeals to consider this problem as crucial. Here, we shall consider a way of attempting more sound inferences from experiments employing subject variables. Drawing sound inferences in quasi-experiments. Matching again. The basic problem in the investigation of subject variables and in other ex post facto research is that whatever differences are observed in behavior may be caused by their confounded variables. One way to try to avoid this problem is by matching subjects on the other relevant variables. In the comparison of schizophrenics and normal people, we noted that the two groups were also likely to differ on other characteristics such as IQ, education, motivation, institutionalization, and perhaps even age. Rather than simply comparing the schizophrenics with normal people, we might try to compare them with another group more closely matched on these other dimensions, so that we hope the main difference between the groups will be the presence or absence of schizophrenia. For example, we might choose a group of patients who on the average are similar to the schizophrenics in terms of age, IQ, length of time institutionalized, gender, and some measure of motivation. When the two groups have been matched on all these characteristics, then we can more conveniently attribute any difference in performance between them to the factor of interest, namely schizophrenia. By matching, investigators attempt to introduce the crucial characteristic of experimentation, being able to hold constant extraneous factors to avoid confounding into what is essentially a correlational observation. The desire is to allow one to infer that the variable of interest in brackets schizophrenia produces the observed effect. Several problems are associated with the matching method. For one thing, it often requires a great deal of effort because some of the relevant variables may be quite difficult to measure. Even when one goes through the trouble of taking the needed additional measures, it may still be impossible to match the groups, especially if few subjects are involved before matching is attempted. Even when matching is successful, it often greatly reduces the size of the sample on which the observations are made. We then have less confidence in our observations because they may not be stable and repeatable. Matching is often difficult because crucial differences among subjects may have subtle effects. In addition, the effect of one difference may interact with another. Thus, subtle interactions among matched variables may confound the results. To illustrate these difficulties, let us consider some of the work done by Brownstein and Associates on neonatal behavior, in bracket Lester and Brownstein 1982. Brownstein's primary interest is in cultural differences in neonatal behavior, as measured by the Brownstein Neonatal Behavioral Assessment Scale. Thus, subtle interactions among matched variables may confound the results. To illustrate these difficulties, let us consider some of the work done by Brownstein and Associates on neonatal behavior, in bracket Lester and Brownstein 1982. Brownstein's primary interest is in cultural differences in neonatal behavior, as measured by the Brownstein's Neonatal Behavioral Assessment Scale. The general strategy is to compare neonates from various cultures and ethnic groups with neonates from the United States. In these quasi-experiments, culture or ethnic group, which is a subject variable, is a quasi-independent variable. Attempts are usually made to match the babies from different cultures along various dimensions, such as birth, weight, birth length, and obstetrical risk in brackets, including whether the mother received medication during birth, whether the baby was premature, and so on. Lester and Brownstein show that there is a synergistic relationship among these factors. Synergism in a medical context means that the combined effects of two or more variables are not additive. The combined effect is greater than the sum of the individual components. This means that the variables interact. The way in which neonatal characteristics and obstetrical risk interact is thus explained. Studies have shown that the behavior, in brackets, as measured by the Brownstein scale, of slightly underweight infants is more strongly influenced, in bracket, negatively, by small amounts of medication taken by the mother than is the behavior of neonates who are closer to the average in weight. Even though the neonates are carefully selected, subtle and interactive effects of the matched variables are rarely under direct control, which means that the possibility of confounding is always present. Another problem with matching involves the introduction of the dreaded regression artifact. Under certain conditions, in many types of measurements, a statistical phenomenon known as regression to the mean occurs. The mean of a group of scores is what is taken as the average, the total of all observations divided by the number of observations. For example, mean height in a sample of 60 people is the sum of all their heights divided by 60. Typically, if people who receive extreme scores, in brackets, that is very high or very low, on some characteristics are retested, their second scores will be closer to the mean of the entire group that are their original scores. Consider an example. We give 200 people a standard test of mathematical reasoning for which there are two equivalent forms or two versions of the test that we know to be equivalent. The average, in bracket, mean score on the test is 60 of 100 possible points. We take the 15 people who scored the highest and the 15 who scored the lowest. The mean of these groups is, say, 95 and 30 respectively. Then we test them again on the other version of the test. Now we might find that the means of the two groups are 87 and 35. On the second test, the scores of these two extreme groups regress towards the mean. The high-scoring group scores more poorly and the low-scoring group does somewhat better. Basically, this happens for the high-scoring group because some people whose true scores are somewhat lower than actually tested locked out and scored higher than they should have on the test. When retested, people with extremely high scores tend to score lower, near their true score. The situation is reversed for the low-scoring group. That is, to some of them who score below their true scores on the first test, retesting leads to their scoring higher or nearer the true score. This regression towards the mean is always observed under condition where there is a less than perfect correlation between the two measures. The more extreme the selection of scores, the greater the regression towards the mean. It also occurs in all types of measurement situations. If abnormally tall or short parents have a child, it will likely be closer to the population mean than the height of the parents. As with most statistical phenomena, regression to the mean is true of groups of observations and is probabilistic, in brackets, that is, it may not occur every time. For example, a few individual subjects may move away from the mean in the second test of mathematical reasoning, but the group tendency will be towards the mean. But how does regression towards the mean affect quasi-experiments in which subjects have been matched on some variable? Again, consider an example. This one, like much ex post facto research done or applied to societal problems, has important implications. Let us assume that we have an educational program that we believe will be especially advantageous for increasing the reading scores of Hausa children in southwestern Nigeria. This is especially important because the scores of Hausa children may be typically lower than those of the Yorubas, presumably because they are from two different cultural environments. We find much to our surprise that the Hausa children actually perform worse after the reading program than before it, and the Yoruba children improve. We conclude, of course, that the program helped Yoruba children but actually hurt Hausa children, despite the fact that it was especially designed for the latter. This conclusion, even though it may seem reasonable to you, is almost surely erroneous in this case, because the regression artifact consider what happened when the Hausa and the Yoruba children were matched on initial reading scores. Since the populations differed initially, with the Hausa children scoring lower than their Yoruba counterparts, in order to match the two samples, it was necessary to select the Hausa students having higher scores than the mean in their group, and the Yoruba students having lower scores than the rest for their group mean. Having picked these extreme groups, we will predict, in bracket, because of regression to the mean, that when retested, the Hausa children would have poorer scores and that the Yoruba children will have better ones. On the average, even if the reading improvement program had no effect at all, the exceptionally high scoring Hausa children would tend to regress towards the mean of their group, and the low scoring Yoruba children will regress towards the mean for their group. The same thing would have happened if there had been no program and the children had been simply retested. The same outcome would likely have been obtained if children had been matched on IQs instead of reading scores, since the two are probably positively correlated. So simply finding another matching variable may not be a solution. One solution would be to match every large sample of Hausa and Yoruba children and then split each group, giving the reading program to one subgroup but not to the other. All would be retested at the end of the program. One of the subgroups of Hausa and Yoruba children should, of course, be random. Regression to the mean will be expected in both subgroups, but the effects of the reading program could be evaluated against the group that had no program. Perhaps the Hausa children with the reading program will show much less drop, in brackets, regression to the mean, than those without, indicating that the program really did have a positive effect. Because quasi-experimental research with subject variables is conducted quite often to evaluate educational programs, its practitioners need to be aware of the many thorny problems associated with its use. One may not be able to say much with regard to the results or draw important conclusions because of confounding variables. Matching helps alleviate this problem in some cases, where its use is possible. But then, one introduces the possibility of regression artifacts, but many researchers seem to be unaware of this problem. When matching is a practical possibility, and when regression artifacts are evaluated, we can feel somewhat more confident of conclusions from our results. But we should remember that what we have is still only a correlation, though a very carefully controlled one. Matching is sometimes useful, but it is not a cure-all. As in our earlier example, if we compare schizophrenics with others on mental test performance, and the schizophrenics still perform worse than the new match control group, could we then conclude that schizophrenia produces inferiority in language usage? No, we could not. The outcome could still be attributed to something else, some other difference between the two groups. We can never be absolutely sure that the outcome is caused by schizophrenia. Study session summary. In this study session, we have stated that the quasi-experiments in psychology often employ subject variables. These variables are measures such as age, IQ, mental health, height, hair, color, sex, and the myriad of other characteristics, which differ from one person to another. Such variables are determined after the fact, since they are often inherited dispositions, in brackets, or at least people come to the psychological study with the variables already determined. Such studies are correlational in nature. End of study session 7. Thank you for listening.